You're listening to the audiobook for Elvis and the Beatles by Trina Young. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. Chapter 2, Heartbreak Hotel. Quote, "It was Elvis who got me hooked for beat music. When I heard Heartbreak Hotel, I thought, this is it." John Lennon. Elvis Presley, deemed the king of rock and roll by the media in 1956, never claimed that he invented rock and roll. In fact, he acknowledged that rock and roll had been around since 1951, sung by African American artists, several years before he started his career. Quote, "I was just lucky enough to be there at the right place and the right time to hand over their music to a white audience," Elvis said. Sam Phillips, who had been having modest success with black rhythm and blues artists on his record label for several years, finally found a singer with breakthrough potential, quote, "a white man with the Negro sound and the Negro feel," unquote. Quote, "Where Elvis was concerned, there was no color line because everybody liked his music," recalled rhythm and blues singer Ruth Brown. Elvis Presley was what they were looking for to get that music, permissible for the white kids to listen to, and openly, unquote. To those who say another white singer could have come along and done the same thing if there was no Elvis, Greil Marcus responds, quote, "No singer emerged with anything like Elvis's combination of great talent and conscious ambition. It was the genius of his singing, an ease and an intensity that has no parallel in American music, that along with his dreams separated him from his context," unquote. In rock and roll music, Elvis combined gospel, country, pop, and rhythm and blues, all the music he had grown up listening to. As a child, Elvis attended the First Assembly of God Church with his parents, just around the corner from their home in Tupelo. "When Elvis was just a little fellow, he would slide off my lap, run down the aisle and scramble up to the platform of the church," explained Elvis's mother, Gladys Presley. "He would stand looking up at the choir and try to sing with them. He was too little to know the words, but he could carry the tune," unquote. In 1947, the Presley family moved to North Green Street in Tupelo. It was a predominantly black neighborhood surrounded by black churches and juke joints that whites referred to as Darktown. From the ages of 12 to 13, Elvis soaked up the African American culture, especially the music. Living on North Green Street, Elvis, quote, "lived in the middle of a black world, where he gained an intimacy with that culture that was rare among white people," described author Joel Williamson. Elvis's exposure was different even from that of his parents, since he came to know the black community in Tupelo in ways that only a 12- and 13-year-old white boy could know it. Between the black businesses, cafes, pool hall and churches, without a doubt, with his almost miraculous ear and passion for music, virtually any music, he drank in those sounds and sights on North Green Street, continued Williamson. When he was 12 and 13, they became a part of him, unquote. Down in Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis said in 1956, "I used to hear old Arthur Crudup bang his box the way I do now, and I said if I ever got to the place I could feel all old Arthur felt, I'd be a music man like nobody ever saw." Elvis continued his absorption of black culture when he and his parents moved to Memphis in November 1948. Because they were poor, the Presleys lived the same kind of life as any poor black family, quote, "Poor people in the South, both black and white, shared a common heritage that stamped them as outsiders," according to author Michael Bertrand. The two groups shared similar living conditions, effects of poverty, endurance of scorn, and pursuit of relief, unquote. In 1953, Elvis and his parents moved out of the government housing project, Lauderdale Courts. The street they moved to in Memphis was shared by both blacks and whites. High school friend, Buzzy Forbes describes how nearby there were, quote, "colored beer joints, and it wasn't unusual to walk into one of those to get a Coke." At this time, Elvis heard a lot of rhythm and blues, unquote. However, there is a misconception among some that Elvis copied the black music of the time and used it for his own success. Quote, "A lot of people have accused Elvis of stealing the black man's music," said soul singer Jackie Wilson, when in fact, almost every black solo entertainer copied his stage mannerisms from Elvis, unquote. Elvis was always the first to give credit to the black community. He told Jet magazine in 1957, quote, "A lot of people seem to think I started this business, but rock and roll was here a long time before I came along. Nobody can sing that kind of music like colored people. Let's face it, I can't sing it like Fats Domino can. I know that. But I always liked that kind of music. I used to go to the colored churches when I was a kid, like Reverend Brewster's church, unquote. Elvis's genius was his ability to mix multiple styles of music from the white and black cultures. Early in his career, a Memphis columnist summarized Presley's singing style, quote, "He has a white voice and sings with a Negro rhythm which borrows in mood and emphasis from country style." Rockabilly legend Carl Perkins addressed how rock and roll challenged segregation in the South, quote, "There was no segregation in music. When you walked up to an old 54 or 55 model Wurlitzer jukebox, it didn't say blue suede shoes, Carl Perkins, white, Blueberry Hill, Fats Domino, black. No, there was no difference. Kids danced to Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Elvis, unquote." In fact, during the 1950s, Elvis was very popular in the African American community. As noted by author Michael Bertrand, between April 1956 and September 1958, Presley had 22 songs among the top 15 on Billboard's Rhythm and Blues charts, charts that were meant to capture the tastes of black listeners and buyers. "He was an integrator," said Little Richard. "Elvis was a blessing. They wouldn't let black music through. He opened the door for black music," unquote. Some white kids who were heavily influenced by rock and roll, and especially Elvis, were the Beatles. In January 1956, Elvis Presley released Heartbreak Hotel, and that seemed to change everything for rock and roll history. "It was Elvis who really got me hooked for beat music," said John Lennon in 1963. "When I heard Heartbreak Hotel I thought, this is it, and I started trying to grow sideboards and all that gear," unquote. In the US, Elvis achieved fame with Heartbreak Hotel becoming his first #1 pop single, but in the UK, he inspired a revolution. Many British rock stars who emerged in the 1960s would trace their interest in rock and roll back to the release of Heartbreak Hotel. "The one that really turned me on, like an explosion one night, was Heartbreak Hotel," said Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. "That was the stunner. I'd never heard it before, or anything like it. I'd never heard of Elvis before. It was almost as if I'd been waiting for it to happen. When I woke up the next day I was a different guy," unquote. Elvis interpreted the song, not with his usual rockabilly or country style, but with, quote, "pure blues which could be heard in his tone and pacing," says author Ace Collins. "His voice sounded mournful, his pain was obvious, and his loss could be felt in the words," unquote. Heartbreak Hotel was not your typical rock and roll song. As authors Samuel Roy and Tom Aspell explained, the bluesy and brooding feel of the song was so different that people around the world sat up and took notice. There has rarely been a more riveting portrait of lost love. In addition, the sensuality evoked on the song Heartbreak Hotel would mark the rise of Elvis Presley as a major sex symbol. "When I first heard Heartbreak Hotel," John Lennon said, "I could hardly make out what was being said. It was just the experience of hearing it and having my hair stand on end. We'd never heard American voices singing like that. They always sang like Sinatra or enunciated very well. Suddenly, there's this hillbilly hiccuping on tape echo and all this bluesy stuff going on. To us, it just sounded like a noise that was great. Me whole life changed from then on, I was just completely shaken by it," unquote. The success of Heartbreak Hotel was a shock to many in the music business. Even Sam Phillips, who had just sold Presley's recording contract to RCA, thought Heartbreak Hotel would be a flop. It was only because of Elvis's strong belief in the song that convinced A&R man, Steve Sholes, who didn't like the song either, to release it as Presley's first RCA single, and the rest is history. After Presley sang Heartbreak Hotel on the Milton Berle Show on April 3, 1956, the song flew up the charts. On April 21, 1956, the song hit #1 in the US and remained there for 8 weeks. At the end of 1956, Billboard rated it as the year's #1 single. With the success of Heartbreak Hotel and other songs, Elvis quickly became a household name in 1956. As a result, there were endless attacks in the media and from the older generation against his performance style and rock and roll in general. Quote, it was mainly parents and they were against rock and roll anyway before the Beatles came along. I mean, people have been trying to stamp out rock and roll since it started, John Lennon explained in a 1975 interview. I always thought it was 'cause it came from black music and the words had a lot of double entendre in the early days. And it was sort of the white kids, our white nice wasps are going to go crazy with all this moving their bodies. You know, the music got to your body and the Beatles just carried it a bit further, made it a little more white even than Elvis did because we were English, unquote. Since most rock and roll music was being produced in the United States during the 1950s and early 1960s, no one ever dreamed that a band from Britain would surpass the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. But the Beatles had an advantage over many American artists in their formative years. Unlike most places in the US, in Liverpool, the teenaged Beatles were exposed to both black and white singers and musicians. In the 1950s, the US was still heavily segregated. The segregation extended to radio stations as well. Black singers were usually not played on white radio stations, and vice versa. Living in Liverpool had a dual advantage for the Beatles. First, Liverpool was a port where sailors would bring home records from the US that most British teens were not exposed to, due to the government-controlled BBC, and second, Liverpool had a racial diversity which enabled the white and black cultures to feed off of each other musically. It may not be as obvious as Elvis, but the Beatles also took their influences from both the black and white cultures and incorporated them into their own style. For example, here's just a small sample of the many songs released by black artists that the Beatles recorded in the early days: Twist and Shout by the Isley Brothers, Please Mr. Postman by the Shirelles, and You Really Got a Hold on Me by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Quote, "People to this day think we wrote Twist and Shout," Paul McCartney told Little Steven in 2015. "When we came to America, we suddenly realized that there was a lot of white kids who didn't know your own American scene. It was kind of race music and all these strange categories that just didn't occur to us, that just didn't happen in England. We didn't realize you didn't know them. We didn't have those prejudices that sometimes, in fact, often occurred in certain places in America," unquote. The Beatles were also fans of country and rockabilly music. George Harrison especially was a big fan of Carl Perkins. Perkins happened to get his start at the same Sun studio in Memphis that Elvis Presley did. In fact, it was Perkins who first wrote and recorded Blue Suede Shoes in January 1956. A few months later, Presley released his own version. The Beatles covered many of Carl Perkins' songs including Honey Don't, Matchbox, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. Quote, "People say the Colonel has a good thing in me. Sure he has," said Elvis. "And I've got a good thing in him." Colonel Tom Parker and Elvis had an extremely loyal relationship. They first met in February 1955. Parker had managed the career of country singer, Eddie Arnold, until 1953 and then managed country star, Hank Snow. Both singers had recording contracts with RCA. At that first meeting, which included Sam Phillips and Presley's current manager, Bob Neal, Colonel Parker brought up the fact that Elvis's commercial potential was being severely limited at the small Sun record label. While Sam Phillips was highly insulted by the remarks, a seed was planted in Elvis's head about how he needed to move to a bigger record label. As Elvis historian Ernst Jorgensen described, Elvis, quote, "would bring up the inadequacies of Sun Records to Bob Neal, and to just about everyone else who cared to listen, for the rest of his stay with the label," unquote. "I think Presley was a star from the first day he ever started going into show business," said Colonel Parker in 1956. "I think anyone could have helped him that knows something about show business. I think my experience, in a small way, handling his future with making contracts, where perhaps someone would offer a certain amount of money and I thought this artist was worth more and I held out for my price. I've lost some deals but I gained some others by waiting," unquote. In early 1955, Parker began booking Elvis on bigger tours through his Jamboree Attractions booking and management company co-owned by Hank Snow. These tours, headlined by Snow, brought massive exposure to Elvis that he was not getting before. On these tours, Elvis also shared the bill with artists like Slim Whitman, the Carter Sisters, and very early in his career, Buddy Holly. In the months that followed, Colonel Parker was in contact with RCA, suggesting that he would be able to secure them a contract with Presley. In the summer of 1955, Elvis was on board with having Colonel Parker be his special advisor. The contract was signed in August 1955 and would last for 1 year. The next few months would see a battle for power between Colonel Parker and Bob Neal, with Parker criticizing Neal's lack of management skills to Presley's parents. By October 1955, Parker had convinced Gladys and Vernon Presley to throw their full support behind him to further their son's career. In October 1955, Parker officially approached Sam Phillips, with the backing of Elvis and his parents, in hopes of RCA buying Presley's recording contract. Phillips was now open to the idea of selling Presley's contract. At this point, Phillips was in desperate need of cash to keep his record label going. He gave Parker the unheard price of $35,000 plus $5,000 for back royalties owed to Elvis. At the time, that was an extremely high price to pay for an artist's contract. In later years, Ahmet Ertegun, founder of Atlantic Records, revealed that he was interested in buying Presley's Sun Records contract, but he couldn't come up with that much money at the time. In November 1955, the deal with RCA was made and the papers were signed at the Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis. That day, a management agreement was also signed giving Colonel Parker 25% of Presley's earnings, which would be split with Bob Neal until his management contract expired in March 1956. Later that day, Elvis sent a telegram to Colonel Parker, solidifying the loyal relationship that Elvis and the Colonel would share for the next 22 years. Dear Colonel, words can never tell you how my folks and I appreciate what you did for me. I have always known, and now my folks are assured, that you are the best and most wonderful person I could ever hope to work with. Believe me when I say I will stick with you through thick and thin and do everything I can to uphold your faith in me. Again I say thanks and I love you like a father." End quote. The following year, a surprisingly humble Colonel Parker had some gracious words for both RCA and Sun Records. "The RCA Victor people have done a great deal for this boy," Parker said in a 1956 interview. "I think they've done more than anyone else to exploit his talents all over the world. The first recording company, Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee, I think we should all be grateful at least that they put his first record out. If they hadn't, perhaps no one would have ever found Elvis Presley." Unquote. In 1956, as Elvis Presley was igniting a musical and cultural revolution, over in the UK, 15-year-old John Lennon was attending Quarry Bank High School. He first heard Heartbreak Hotel in April 1956, shortly after its release in the UK in March, and it literally changed his life. Lennon's best friend, Pete Shotton, recalled the impact that Elvis had, quote, "We all automatically wanted to dress like Elvis, look like Elvis, swagger, strut and sneer like Elvis, and every snide remark from Aunt Mimi, our teachers, or the newspapers only served to reinforce our new idol's grip on John's and my young psyches." Pete said John was the first at his high school to wear his hair slicked back like Elvis. Lennon was known as the leading rock and roll aficionado at the school. After Heartbreak Hotel, the hits kept coming from Elvis, including Blue Suede Shoes, Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel. Captivated by Presley, Shotton explained that he and Lennon found the wait for each new Elvis record almost unbearable. One day a schoolmate of Lennon's turned him onto another rock and roll singer, Little Richard. He played Richard's Long Tall Sally record over and over again because Lennon couldn't get enough of it. "When I heard Long Tall Sally, it was so great I couldn't speak," Lennon recalled. "You know how it is when you are torn? Elvis was bigger than religion in my life. I didn't want to leave Elvis. We all looked at each other, but I didn't want to say anything against Elvis, even in my mind." Little Richard's Long Tall Sally would become a standard cover song the Beatles would sing at their live concerts. John Lennon first started playing the banjo at his birth mother, Julia's, house. He finally got his first acoustic guitar in March 1957, although he was practicing on a borrowed guitar since late 1956. His mother, Julia, who he reunited with as a preteen, ordered the guitar from a mail-order catalog since guitars were scarce due to the skiffle craze. Later, in 1959, John convinced his Aunt Mimi, who he lived with at their home called Mendips, to buy him an electric guitar. I battled against it for quite a long time," Aunt Mimi explained. "I didn't want him wasting his college time, missing lectures, by wasting his time playing a guitar. Whereas his training would last, these things come and go. They're playing a guitar 1 week, everybody's clamoring for them, then they disappear, nobody ever hears of them again," unquote. From John Lennon's perspective, becoming a singer like Elvis seemed unimaginable, since he was American for starters. However, when the skiffle craze hit in 1956 led by Lonnie Donegan's hit Rock Island Line, Lennon and many other British teenagers saw a way they could play music themselves. British singer Donegan showed that you didn't have to be a pro or have expensive instruments to play rock and roll. He used a washboard for a drum kit and a do-it-yourself bass made from a tea chest, broom handle and string. Around November 1956, John Lennon convinced his friends at Quarry Bank that they should form a skiffle group. It didn't matter that none of them really knew how to play instruments, they could learn. They named their group the Quarrymen, after their school, and thus, a new rock and roll band was born. In the spring of 1957, 16-year-old John Lennon was focusing all his energy on his new band. He was learning guitar, building on banjo lessons that his mother had taught him. Like John, his mother, Julia, loved Elvis Presley too. However, Lennon's Aunt Mimi, who he lived with, not so much. "It was Elvis Presley, Elvis Presley, Elvis Presley," Aunt Mimi described. "In the end I said, Elvis Presley's all very well, John, but I don't want him for breakfast, dinner and tea," she told him. The Quarrymen were making progress adding new members that had their own equipment. Colin Hanton had a drum kit, Rod Davis had a banjo and Eric Griffiths had a guitar as did Lennon. Pete Shotton played the washboard and Len Gary played the tea-chest bass. In June 1957, the Quarrymen played live at neighborhood events. They were becoming popular performing at St. Peter's Youth Club in Woolton. Soon after, the Quarrymen skiffle group would play a gig at the St. Peter's Church Fete on July 6, 1957, which would change the course of music history. A 15-year-old named Paul McCartney was invited to come see the Quarrymen by a mutual friend of his and John Lennon's, Ivan Vaughan. McCartney, like Lennon, also had his own epiphany about Elvis Presley in 1956 and started playing the guitar. Quote, "I started to see pictures of Elvis, and that started to pull me away from the academic path," McCartney recalled. "You should see these photos, then you'd hear the records, but wait a minute, this is very good. And then the tingles started going up and down your spine, oh, this is something altogether different." And so the academic things were forgotten. Paul played 20 Flight Rock in his informal audition for the band. He first saw Eddie Cochran perform the song in the 1956 film, The Girl Can't Help It. John Lennon was impressed by McCartney's guitar skills and the fact that he knew all the lyrics to the song. A few days after their first meeting, Paul was asked to join the Quarrymen. Paul's official debut with the group was in October 1957. John and Paul bonded over their love for Elvis and Little Richard. As a result, the Quarrymen's live shows would feature cover versions of their favorite rock and roll songs. From 1957 to 1962, the Quarrymen and later the Beatles would perform many Presley tunes live, including Heartbreak Hotel, All Shook Up, Baby Let's Play House, Blue Suede Shoes, Don't Be Cruel, Blue Moon of Kentucky, Good Rockin' Tonight, I Forgot to Remember to Forget, That's All Right, Jailhouse Rock, and many more. Elvis is a truly great vocalist, and you can hear why on this song, Heartbreak Hotel, Paul McCartney said in 2005. His phrasing, his use of echo, it's all so beautiful. It's the way he sings it too. As if he's singing it from the depths of hell. It's a perfect example of a singer being in command of the song. Musically it's perfect, too. The double bass and the walk-in piano create this incredibly haunting atmosphere. It's so full of mystery, and it's never lost that for me. The echo is just stunning. When the Beatles were recording, we'd often ask George Martin for the Elvis echo. I think we got it down perfectly on A Day in the Life, unquote. In 1957, Elvis was at the top of his game. He had conquered the charts and started a musical revolution. In 1956, Elvis had 4 number 1 hits, Heartbreak Hotel, I Want You, I Need You, I Love You, Don't Be Cruel/Hound Dog and Love Me Tender. By the end of 1956, Presley had sold millions of records, made a record-breaking string of appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, and had also starred in his first film, Love Me Tender. Many rock and roll stars appeared in movies. It was a great way to expand their musical reach. In fact, the only way John Lennon, Paul McCartney, or any of the other quarrymen in Liverpool saw Elvis performing was in the movies. They didn't get to see Presley's live U.S. television performances on the Dorsey Brothers stage show, the Milton Berle Show, the Steve Allen Show, or even the Ed Sullivan Show. And, of course, there was no internet or DVDs back then. John Lennon's half-sister, Julia Baird, describes how her mother, Julia, took them all to see Love Me Tender. Quote, "As soon as it came out, our mother took John, Jackie, and me to Garston Cinema, in a state of high excitement, and we began life anew. We watched it 4 or 5 times over 2 days, at a time when you could hide in the dark of the cinema all day if you wanted to. By the time we left we knew all the words to all the songs and the film script too. We were smitten." Unquote. In 1957, Elvis starred in 2 movies which showcased his singing and acting talents, Loving You and Jailhouse Rock. Loving You was closest to the real story of Elvis Presley the rock star compared to any of his other 30 feature films. It presented him as an up-and-coming singer who toured the South with a country-style band. It also depicted the interactions between an artist and their manager, although the manager was female in the film. You went to see those movies with Elvis or somebody in it when we were still in Liverpool, and you'd see everybody waiting to see him, recalled John Lennon in 1975. And I'd be waiting there too, and they'd all scream when he came on the screen. So we thought, that's a good job. That's why most musicians are on stage actually, to get a little extra." Unquote. American films had a lag time of several months before making it to the UK. While Loving You was released in July 1957 in the States, it didn't appear in Liverpool until October. In the film, the plot reflected reality in a sense, showing how as Presley's popularity grew, so did the interest of female fans, much to the disappointment not only of their parents and society at large, but also of their jealous boyfriends. It also showcased Elvis's natural dance movements. We went to see Loving You and, later, Jailhouse Rock, time and time again, recalls Julia Baird. Sometimes, John took us by himself and he would always nip out to smoke when the cartoons or Path News came on." Unquote. It is not clear whether Paul, George and Ringo also got to see Love Me Tender or Loving You in the theaters in Liverpool in 1957. However, according to author Mark Luizone, in March 1958, John, Paul, George and Ringo all got to see Presley's iconic performance in Jailhouse Rock at the Forum Cinema in Liverpool. "We all loved Elvis, he was so hot," Paul McCartney gushed years later. "We were just so in love with him. He was just the greatest idol, always hamming it up, always doing a little funny thing. He was so great." Unquote. After being released from prison, Presley's character in Jailhouse Rock, Vince Everett, becomes a recording sensation with the help of a female business partner. Songs performed by Elvis in the film include You're So Square, Baby, I Don't Care, Treat Me Nice and of course, the famous dance sequence set to Jailhouse Rock. Quote, "What links the greatest rock and roll careers is a volcanic ambition, a lust for more than anyone has a right to expect, in some cases, a refusal to know when to quit or even rest," observed music critic Greil Marcus. "The arrogance of a country boy like Elvis sailing into Hollywood, ready for whatever kind of success America had to offer." Unquote. To be able to carry the mantle of the king of rock and roll for over 20 years during his lifetime, there had to be an inner strength that Elvis was born with and cultivated as he faced the trials and tribulations of his career. "You accept the bad along with the good," Elvis said in 1956. "I've been getting some very good publicity, the press have been real wonderful to me, and I've had some bad publicity, but you have to expect that." Describing it as bad publicity may have been a huge understatement. As Presley's popularity grew in 1956, there were numerous public outcries against Elvis declared by parents, the media, religious leaders, and politicians. In August 1956, Elvis was warned by a judge in Jacksonville, Florida, to tone down his act, referred to by the judge as an obscene burlesque dance, for 2 upcoming concerts or be presented with a warrant for his arrest for impairing the morals of minors. Elvis was baffled. He told the press, "I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I know my mother approves of what I'm doing," unquote. Many authority figures who spoke out against Presley seemed to use their public disapproval of Elvis for their own publicity purposes. Quote, Judge Gooding used the threat as if it were a platform in a political campaign, Scotty Moore described. He treated Elvis like a terrorist who had invaded the homeland, unquote. As a result of the threat, Elvis modified his dancing for the 2 shows, virtually standing still. Instead, he wiggled his little finger suggestively, enough to still make the crowd go wild. The anti-Elvis hysteria even spread to Canada. In 1957, students at the Notre Dame convent in Ottawa were asked to sign an oath that they would never attend one of Presley's sinful concerts. 8 girls got expelled because they refused to stay away from his show. The FBI kept a massive file on Elvis starting in 1956 and lasting until his death. A 1956 memo to the FBI described Elvis as a definite danger to the security of the United States because of his influence on the youth of America. In June 1956, Presley's career was almost ruined after an appearance on The Milton Berle Show. He was singing his yet-to-be-recorded future hit single Hound Dog. Instead of ending the song at the appropriate verse, something came over Elvis and he extended the song, adding not 1, but 2 slowed-down striptease-style verses. When Elvis started singing the seductive verses of Hound Dog on The Berle Show, he also started dancing in an impromptu burlesque style. Not only was the audience surprised, as evident by their mixture of faint screams and laughter, but so was Presley's band. According to drummer DJ Fontana, he and the rest of Presley's band did not know Elvis was going to do this. This had been the second time Elvis had performed without a guitar on national television. Of the 6 appearances he made on the Dorsey Brothers stage show previously, he almost always had a guitar in front of him to hide or tone down his natural body movements. However, the more Elvis performed, the more he realized his natural dancing excited the girls in the crowd. This appearance on the Milton Berle Show mirrored his evolution as a live performer from being a traditional singer holding a guitar to an all-out entertainer who danced all over the stage. This whole episode may have seemed harmless, but in fact, it had just the opposite effect. The media went into an uproar after seeing Elvis gyrating on stage in an obscene performance, and the nickname Elvis the Pelvis took hold. One journalist said that popular music, quote, has reached its lowest depths in the grunt and groin antics of one Elvis Presley. The Elvis the Pelvis label had already been circulating as a result of similar dance moves that Elvis had been doing on stage at local concert appearances. Just 2 days before, at a performance in Oakland, California, one reviewer described Presley as a young man with a virile voice and twitching hip muscles. In truth, Milton Berle was partially responsible for the scandal. Presley's exaggerated moves during Hound Dog seemed to be prompted by the TV host to enhance a comedic skit. Right after Presley's performance, Berle came out mimicking Elvis's dance moves to get laughs from the audience. Photographer Al Wertheimer, who was taking pictures of Elvis that day, confirmed that, quote, Milton Berle encouraged Elvis to bump and grind on the show, unquote. However, as a result of Berle giving Presley the nudge to brazenly exaggerate his dance moves on national television, the nickname Elvis the Pelvis went viral on a national level. In a response to a story on Elvis featured in the May 14, 1956 issue of Time, one reader wrote in, quote, "Are you sure that fellow's real name isn't Pelvis Presley?" Steve Allen, who had scheduled Elvis to appear on his show the following month, expressed there was strong pressure to cancel Elvis's appearance. If he did appear, Allen said, Presley would not be allowed any of his offensive tactics. It seemed like a real setback for Presley's career. However, Elvis returned to TV with a less threatening appearance in what Steve Allen jokingly called Presley's first comeback. Before Presley's performance, Allen showed Elvis and the audience a petition sent in from a DJ in Tulsa, Oklahoma that was signed by over 18,000 fans saying they wanted to see Elvis again on TV. On July 1, 1956, the new Elvis Presley, as he was introduced, performed on The Steve Allen Show in a tuxedo with tails to set things right with the older generation. Elvis later expressed regret for his participation in singing Hound Dog to a basset hound on Allen's show, but at least for the time being, he had calmed his critics. A few months later, Elvis would cement his stardom by making 3 separate appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. However, to avoid creating another Elvis the Pelvis scandal, the producers would only show Presley from the waist up during his entire 3rd appearance. Quote, "Remember, it wasn't just the way Elvis looked, it was the way he moved that made people crazy, pissed off, driven to screaming ecstasy, and profane revulsion," observed Bruce Springsteen. That was television. When they made an attempt to censor him from the waist down, it was because of what you could see happening in his pants. Elvis was the first modern 20th century man creating fundamental, outsider art that would be embraced by a mainstream popular culture, unquote. In his first year at RCA, Elvis Presley was responsible for over 50% of the label's single sales. At the end of 1957, Billboard announced that Elvis had placed more songs in the top 100 than any other artist since records were first charted. But something came along that threatened to end Presley's success. As early as 1956, there was talk of Elvis Presley receiving his impending draft notice. At the time, all men in the U.S. between 18.5 and 26 years old were eligible to be drafted for 24 months of military service. On January 8, 1957, as Elvis turned 22 years old, the Memphis Draft Board announced that as a result of his pre-induction physical, Elvis had been classified as 1A, available for unrestricted military service. His fans began bracing for the news of that fateful day when he would be drafted. Finally, in December 1957, Elvis received his official induction notice. He requested and was granted a 60-day extension until March 1950. Instead of accepting a special assignment to entertain the troops, Presley agreed to enlist just like any other regular guy. At the urging of his manager Colonel Parker, Elvis refused any special treatment. On March 24, 1958, when Elvis reported for duty at the Memphis Draft Board, he was terrified, not of his upcoming service, but of the ramifications to his entertainment career. 2 years was a long time to be out of the public eye. Would his fans still remember him when he got out of the army? Luckily for the Beatles, the requirement to spend 2 years in the national service in the UK ended in November 1960. Just imagine the ramifications to the success of the Beatles if they each had to serve 2 years in military service. "I don't think there would have been the Beatles," Paul McCartney surmised. "I think we would have been a little group in Liverpool, and if we'd been very lucky, we'd have had some small success in the local clubs. But then just as we were getting somewhere, Ringo and John, being the oldest two, would have had to go into national service, followed shortly by me and then a year later by George, and that would have split any chance of being a group," unquote. Meanwhile, back in 1957, Paul McCartney had met a younger guitar player named George Harrison who rode on the same bus with him to school. Paul was impressed when he discovered that young 14-year-old George was a better guitar player than him. Paul and George struck up a friendship over their common interest in guitars and rock and roll, including Elvis. "I was riding along on my bicycle and heard Heartbreak Hotel coming out of somebody's house," George Harrison reminisced. "It was one of them things I'll never forget. What a sound, what a record. It changed the course of my life." However, George wasn't the ideal choice to join the Quarrymen since he was over 2 years younger than John, a huge gap during the teenage years. "I couldn't be bothered with him when he first came around," John Lennon recalled. "He used to follow me around like a bloody kid, hanging around all the time. It took me years to come round to him, to start considering him as an equal," unquote. But George was so advanced on his guitar compared to anybody else they knew. He could even play guitar solos. "We needed a good guitar player," Paul McCartney recalled. "John and I play a bit of guitar, but we couldn't really solo. We weren't that good. And I said, I know this guy. He's a bit young, but he's good," unquote. Paul said George Harrison first played the guitar instrumental Raunchy for John on the top deck of a Liverpool bus. The song was released in September 1957 by Bill Justice. However, George was not immediately asked to join the band. He insinuated himself into the band gradually. As Pete Shotton described, George's eventual acceptance as the Quarrymen's permanent lead guitarist was largely a tribute to his sheer perseverance, unquote. In addition, George was cool for his age. He dressed like a teddy boy and he had a sharp wit, which could match up to Lennon's any day of the week. George would sit in at rehearsals and fill in when one of the guitarists was absent. After about 2 months of this, Harrison officially joined the group as their lead guitarist in February 1958. It's no question that John Lennon's rock and roll attitude, not his musical skills, attracted him to Paul and George, while it was Paul and George's musical skills that were a benefit for John. But that wasn't the only reason John accepted them into his band. Quote, neither Paul or George would have lasted very long in John's band had John not come to like them so much as people, Pete Shotton observed. Most of the other original members were gradually frozen out of the picture, not so much for lack of musical promise, but simply because John found them a bore, unquote. The king of rock and roll was a far cry from the rebellious image that he portrayed. He didn't drink or smoke and was very spiritually grounded and close to his parents. His physical image of long sideburns, long hair and suggestive gyrations caused an uproar among many conservative parents. But he was nothing like a juvenile delinquent as many were claiming. I haven't set any pattern for juvenile delinquency, Elvis told a reporter in 1957. In my opinion, delinquency is such things as robbing, beatings or knife fights and the like. If these people mean by delinquency riots, we've had those for years, unquote. In 1956, Presley was photographed in a leather jacket while sitting on a motorcycle a la Marlon Brando, but he never wore leather in public appearances during the 1950s. He never wore jeans either, as it reminded him of his poor upbringing. On the other side of the Atlantic, a group of teenage boys in Liverpool inspired by Presley's sideburns and long hair were taking it one step further. In 1958, John Lennon was known as the only Teddy Boy at Liverpool Art College. Teddy boys were a British phenomenon of young men in their late teens and early 20s who dressed in quasi-Edwardian outfits, hence the name Teddy, short for Edward. They represented a stark departure in men's British fashion of the day, wearing long draped jackets of black and blue velvet, Texan string ties, drainpipe trousers, luminous socks and thick-soled suede shoes. Teddy boys originally were fans of jazz and skiffle in the early 1950s. But when the rock and roll craze emerged, they adopted the music as their own. This youth subculture became forever linked to rock and roll and violence when groups of Teddy boys started riots during screenings of the rock and roll film Blackboard Jungle in the UK in 1956. I used to dress like a Teddy boy and identify with Marlon Brando or Elvis Presley, but I was never really in any street fights or down-home gangs, John Lennon revealed. I was just a suburban kid imitating the rockers, unquote. The image was a protective measure, Paul McCartney explained. You could get hit if you didn't look hard. He wore big long sideys and so we looked up to him as a sort of violent Teddy boy, which was attractive at the time, unquote. Lennon's tough guy, rebellious image was amped up several notches after the death of his mother Julia. John Lennon was 17 when his birth mother, Julia, died from a freak car accident on July 15, 1958. As a result, John began to drink heavily for the first time in his life, best friend Pete Shotton recalled. Julia was walking home from John's home, Mendips, where she had been visiting with her sister, Mimi, when she was hit by a car driven by an off-duty policeman. John was waiting for Julia at her house when she was killed. I lost my mother twice, John Lennon explained. Once as a child of 5 and then again at 17. It made me very, very bitter inside. I had just begun to establish a relationship with her when she was killed. We'd caught up on so much in just a few short years. We could communicate. We got on, unquote. Needless to say, Lennon was devastated by the death of Julia, who served not only as a nurturing figure in his life, but also as a musical influence. John's mother loved Elvis Presley and she had a huge influence on John's musical interests. She even named their family cat after Elvis, according to John's half-sister, Julia Baird. This love for rock and roll was something John shared with his mother, a far cry from his relationship with the stern authority figure of his Aunt Mimi, who raised him. Quote, Mimi actually discouraged John's interest in popular music. She wanted nothing to do with it, said Lennon historian, Shelley Germo. She didn't want them to play any of that in the house at all. She wouldn't give him music lessons. So he was shut down when he was at Mimi's. But over at Julia's, she had a banjo, she had a ukulele, she played piano, she played the accordion, and they had a lot of fun, they played a lot of music. She had Elvis records, so this is where he got his influence. Even after they started the Quarrymen, Julia allowed them to play there, unquote. After Lennon's mother died, John and Paul then had something very intimate in common. Paul was only 14 when his mother, Mary, died of cancer on October 31, 1956. Paul did not outwardly express his grief at the time, but it seemed to coincide with his ambitions to pursue music. Only 8 months later, he would meet Lennon for the first time, and his dreams of being a musician would really take flight. Now we were both in this, both losing our mothers, McCartney described. This was a bond for us, something of ours, a special thing. We'd both gone through that trauma and both come out the other side, and we could actually laugh about it in the sick humor of the day, unquote. Notably, McCartney found solace through Elvis Presley's music. If we were feeling lousy, McCartney recalled, we'd go back and play Don't Be Cruel, and we'd be right up there again. It could cure any blues, unquote. One devastating parallel between the personal lives of John Lennon, Paul McCartney and Elvis Presley was the death of their mothers at a relatively young age. The loss of their mothers seemed to have a profound effect on their musical ambitions. Germo described how Julia's death affected John, quote, I think that his devastation left him feeling so abandoned, that if he hadn't formed the Quarrymen by that point, in his words, what he used to say was, it was either this or jail. I don't think he would have done too well if he hadn't already started the Quarrymen. Thank God he had that passion already begun at the time she died. It may have been that in his heart he made a success out of it because of what she left with him, unquote. Not only did music offer Lennon a goal to pursue, but it also served as a form of therapy for John to deal with his mother's death. He had something to focus on, Germo continues. He already had this band and it was already kind of moving. He knew that school was kind of falling apart. He never went to class when he went to the art college, so I think he figured that, this is where I'm going to put my heart and this is where I'm going to put my soul. He put everything into it after that, because I think that was his only choice. And it was therapeutic. And later on he wrote the song Julia in honor of his mom, unquote. While the deaths of the mothers of Lennon and McCartney may have fueled their ambitions, the death of Gladys Presley may have, in a way, softened Elvis's ambition. Elvis had already found fame and fortune when his mother died on August 14, 1958, just 1 month after John Lennon's mother had died. He was 23 years old, but losing his mother Gladys hit him particularly hard because he was so close with her. Quote, I was an only child, and my mother was always with me all my life, and it wasn't only like losing a mother, it was like losing a friend, a companion, someone to talk to, explained Elvis. Presley's mother died during his first 6 months of Army service. While Elvis was stationed in Fort Hood, Texas, his mother, who had been suffering from hepatitis, died suddenly from a heart attack. Elvis was devastated to lose his mother, who died at the relatively young age of 46. A month later, in late September 1958, Elvis would be sent to Germany where he would be stationed for the next 18 months. It was then that Elvis's worldview changed significantly. According to biographer Peter Guralnick, quote, when his mother died it was as if what's it all for? And he articulated that question over and over again for the next 19 years until the day of his death, unquote. Quote, we'd always watched the Elvis films checking to see if he could play guitar, and he could, a little bit. He wasn't bad, he held the shapes, recalls Paul McCartney. But you could tell that Buddy Holly played the solo on Peggy Sue. We were very attracted to him for that reason, and the fact that there was always Holly/Petty or Petty/Holly on the records, so we knew he was one of the writers, unquote. After they met in the summer of 1957, John Lennon and Paul McCartney started writing songs together. Paul had written a song called I Lost My Little Girl and played it for John. This inspired Lennon and McCartney to start working as a songwriting team, and thus, the Lennon/McCartney partnership was born. Not only did the collaboration between John and Paul provide great feedback for each other, but they even served as each other's human tape recorders. Neither Paul nor John could read or write music. We had a rule that came in very early out of sheer practicality, which was, if we couldn't remember the song the next day, then it was no good, McCartney explained. We assumed if we, who had written it, couldn't remember it, what chance would an ordinary member of the public have of remembering it? And it was a rule we stuck to, right up until the introduction, years later, of Philips cassette recorders, unquote. The group's first recording was made in mid-1958. The date, now preserved on a plaque at the former location of the Percy Phillips home recording studio in Liverpool, is documented as July 14, 1958, which was one day before Julia Lennon's tragic death. However, Beatles historian Mark Lewisohn insists that the date of the recording session cannot be verified and could have taken place a few months earlier. The Quarrymen now consisted of John, Paul, George, Colin Hanton on drums and John Duff Lowe on piano. They recorded 2 songs that day, Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day and In Spite of All the Danger, ironically, a song written by Paul McCartney and George Harrison, not Lennon and McCartney. The song was mainly written by Paul, with George contributing his own guitar parts. Paul McCartney admits that the song was an homage to Elvis Presley, quote, "It was my song. It's very similar to an Elvis song. It's me doing an Elvis. I'm a bit loath to say which. It was one that I'd heard at scout camp when I was younger and I'd loved it," unquote. Although Paul won't admit which Elvis song that he modeled In Spite of All the Danger after, some historians including Mark Lewisohn believe it is Tryin' to Get to You. Meanwhile, another plausible theory is that McCartney was using a combination of Elvis songs from that era, since the harmonies sung In Spite of All the Danger are reminiscent of Presley's backup singers, the Jordanaires. Between them, the Quarrymen only had enough money to pay for one record. No tape was ever made. They took turns sharing the sole copy of the 10-inch disc to play it for family and friends. Lowe was the last to have possession of it and ended up keeping it for 23 years. In 1981, McCartney acquired it from him and had engineers clean up the recording. Paul reportedly made 50 copies of the single for family and friends. Both sides of the single, In Spite of All the Danger and That'll Be the Day, appear on the Beatles Anthology 1 released in 1995. By the end of 1958, the other members of the Quarrymen had left the group, leaving just John, Paul and George. Lennon had been studying at the Liverpool Art College since autumn 1957. It was there that he met his future wife, Cynthia, and his best friend, Stuart Sutcliffe, a talented painter. In early 1960, when Stu earned a large sum of money from selling one of his paintings, John convinced him to buy a bass guitar and join the group, even though he had no musical training whatsoever. While John had a special friendship with Paul in relation to music, Stu had a huge impact on John since they shared a deep bond with their passion for art and had strong connections on an intellectual and spiritual level. Stuart's mother, Millie Sutcliffe, described the close friendship between John and Stu, quote, "John admired Stuart's ability in his intelligence and his honesty in his refined manner, very gentlemanly indeed. Stuart likewise admired John's don't give a damn about anybody. I'm not somebody else. Why should I do this because that's the thing everybody does? He refused to be conventional, did his own thing," unquote. In Liverpool, John, Paul, George and Stu used to hang out at the Jacaranda Club owned by Alan Williams. Stuart had painted murals for the basement of the club. Of all the lads, Stuart was closest with Williams, and as a result, Williams let the group perform and rehearse at the club. Noticing their potential, Williams became one of their first booking managers. In 1959, Stuart and John were roommates briefly at an apartment on Gamber Terrace. Stuart was a big fan of rock and roll and dressed the part. There is a photo of Stuart attending a Gene Vincent concert in May 1960 in Liverpool, which also had Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, including drummer Ringo Starr, on the bill. Some people believe John is also in the photo, but it cannot be verified. So, while John persuaded Stuart to be in the band, the truth was that Stuart's true passion was his art. All Sutcliffe really wanted to do was to be a painter, but he reluctantly joined the band for his friend. During their live shows, Stewart would often sing lead on love songs including Elvis Presley's Love Me Tender and Loving You. However, not everyone was happy with his bass playing. Stewart's fiancée, Astrid Kircher, recalled, quote, "John always said when Paul was moaning about how Stewart didn't practice and all that, John always said, it doesn't matter, he looks good. He is rock and roll." Stewart, like John, quick and witty, harsh, but in a more sensitive way, softer way, Astrid Kircher continued. To John, Stewart's personality counted more than anything else. And he felt sort of like looking after Stewart because Stewart was so small and delicate. He really loved him like he would have loved his brother if he had one, unquote. By June 1960, John, Paul, George and Stu were calling themselves the Silver Beatles and went through several temporary drummers to accommodate the gigs they played. At one point, Paul was even playing the drums. 1 month earlier, Alan Williams had become their manager. He got them gigs often in rough parts of town where Teddy boys used to frequent. In July 1960, they played at an illegal strip club owned by Williams. In August 1960, Alan Williams got the Beatles their initial gig in Hamburg, Germany. Many groups from Liverpool were finding success in Hamburg, so the Beatles jumped at the chance. Since they needed a drummer in order to accept the gig, they asked Pete Best to join the band. As Pete Shotton described, they had taken Pete on at a time when beggars couldn't be choosers, and they desperately needed a drummer to complete the lineup, unquote. However, Pete was considered the mystery man of the group. He never shared in the camaraderie of the others, Pete Shotton observed. The one at the back with the smoldering good looks, who never larked about, or sang a song, or said a word, on stage or even off. My impression of Pete, Shotton continues, was that he really didn't have much of anything to say in any case, unquote. Nevertheless, the lineup was set: John Lennon, rhythm guitar; Paul McCartney, rhythm guitar; George Harrison, lead guitar; Stu Sutcliffe, bass guitar; and Pete Best, drums. The Silver Beatles were required to stay in Hamburg for several months. This meant that John Lennon had to drop out of art school. Surprisingly, the king of rock and roll originally wanted to be part of a group, not a rock and roll group, but a gospel group. Before Elvis was called back to Sun Records by producer Sam Phillips, he tried on his own to audition for a few gospel quartets. Elvis's first love was gospel music. In March 1960, Elvis was asked what his favorite style of music was, and he responded, "Spiritual music. I know practically every religious song that's ever been written." Since he didn't pass his auditions with the gospel groups, Presley was forced to try and make it on his own. He used to go listen to gospel quartets perform in Memphis, including the Blackwood Brothers and the Jordanaires. In fact, he told the Jordanaires that if he ever made it, he would ask them to be backup singers on his records. When Elvis started recording for RCA in 1956, he got his wish, insisting to the higher-ups that the Jordanaires sing on all of his records. As a result, Presley essentially built a gospel group around himself. By the end of 1956, Elvis had just finished a streak of 16 consecutive weeks at #1 with Don't Be Cruel/Hound Dog and then Love Me Tender. So why would Presley's record company, RCA, and shrewd business manager, Colonel Parker, allow Elvis to veer off in another musical direction to sing a gospel song on national television and possibly risk alienating his fanbase? The answer is simple: because Elvis insisted. Presley's mother, Gladys, also loved gospel music. Elvis decided he would sing one of his mother's favorite songs, Peace in the Valley, on his third and final appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on January 6, 1957. The show's producers did not want Elvis to sing a gospel song on national television, but Elvis insisted. "No, I told my mother that I was going to do Peace in the Valley for her, and I'm going to do it," he said. Ed Sullivan supported Presley's decision. That night Elvis performed 7 songs including Hound Dog, Heartbreak Hotel, and Don't Be Cruel. At the very end of the show, Presley, backed by the Jordanaires, sang Peace in the Valley. Ed Sullivan introduced the song describing Presley's plea for people to donate to the charitable cause of Hungarian refugee relief. In a subtle attempt to explain Presley's choice to sing a gospel song, Sullivan announced that Elvis was going to, quote, sing a song he feels that this is sort of in the mood that he'd like to create. The network's hesitation with Elvis singing gospel was proven wrong when the public reacted positively to the performance. One writer hailed Presley's appearance on The Sullivan Show as terrific and attacked critics by comparing Elvis's roots in American culture to that of Will Rogers and Carl Sandburg. The positive response prompted RCA to support a 4-song gospel EP called Peace in the Valley, which was released a few months later in April 1957. The Peace in the Valley EP surprised everyone by initially selling over 500,000 copies, and ultimately going platinum, prompting RCA to encourage Elvis to do his first gospel album a few years later. Elvis would go on to record 3 gospel albums during his career. Ironically, the only Grammy Awards the King of Rock and Roll ever won were for his gospel recordings. The Ed Sullivan Show aired live and was, obviously, not broadcast in England at the time, so the Beatles would never have seen this performance by Elvis of Peace in the Valley. Producer Andrew Solt, who purchased the exclusive rights to the library of The Ed Sullivan Show in 1990, first came across Presley's 1956 and 1957 performances on the show in 1972 when he was doing research for Presley's movie, Elvis on Tour. Growing up as an Elvis fan from South Africa, Solt had never seen these shows before. Like a lot of fans outside the US, quote, I grew up in South Africa, I was born in London, I came to America in '59 when I was 11, but I had never seen Elvis except in a movie. When I saw the Sullivan shows I was blown away. There was no videotape, there was no DVD. These things were never released. Nobody had seen them since they aired live, unquote. British fans like the Beatles only had Presley's movies to go by when seeing the image of the King of Rock and Roll. So, seeing the sex god Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show flanked by the 4 Jordanaires, square-looking guys with crew cuts standing behind him, may have seemed odd at the time. And to watch Presley sing a gospel song may have confused, or even disappointed, some of Presley's devout rock and roll fans. But still, even without seeing Presley's live gospel performance, the Beatles started growing weary of Elvis's music releases as early as 1958. As Paul McCartney explained, it started with a Presley #1 single from the movie, King Creole, quote, hard-headed woman, great title, we thought, oh, this is going to be great. Then there's a dreadful great big trombone right in the middle of it, and we thought, good God. What in hell has happened? We were very disappointed about that, and we never really thought he got it back, unquote. However, Elvis was more focused on being an entertainer than a rock and roller. Once he found success in the music business, his goal shifted to become a successful actor, yet another reason for him to admire Dean Martin, who became friends with Elvis and offered him acting advice. The irony is that a young Elvis Presley, who quickly got labeled as the king of rock and roll, saw himself more as a balladeer. He looked up to popular crooners of the day who also had successful movie careers. During his breakthrough year of 1956, Elvis was quoted as saying, I like Crosby, Sinatra, all the big ones. They had to be good to get there. I've always been kind of partial to Dean Martin, unquote. Dean Martin's daughter, Deanna, recalls meeting Elvis on the Paramount studio lot in 1960 when both her father and Elvis were filming movies. Elvis told Deanna, a young 11-year-old, quote, I love your dad. You know, they call me the king of rock and roll, but your dad, he's the king of cool, unquote. Little did Presley's #1 fan, John Lennon, realize that this rock and roll god did not worship the music the same way that he and other up-and-coming rock and roll musicians would. Elvis had a different vision for himself and his career. Quote, I like to sing ballads the way Eddie Fisher does and the way Perry Como does, Presley told a reporter in June 1956. But the way I'm singing now,